The iron cage swayed with every rut in the road, and Lyra Stormborn pressed her palm flat against the cold bars to keep from being thrown against them. Her other hand never left her belly, fingers splayed protectively over the gentle swell where her child grew. 4 months along now. 4 months of hiding the pregnancy from everyone except the healer, who'd confirmed it. And then from the alpha who'd sold her the moment he learned. Breeding stock, Alpha Hendricks had called her when he'd announced the terms. At least you're useful for something, Omega. She could still hear the laughter of her packmates echoing through the great hall. Not one of them had spoken in her defense. Not her mother, who'd looked away. Not her childhood friends, who'd studied their feet. Not even the healer, who'd betrayed her secret for a pouch of silver coins and a promotion to the Alpha's personal staff. The cage hit another rut, and Lyra's teeth clacked together hard enough to send pain shooting through her jaw. She tasted copper and swallowed it down. Almost there, Tribute. The guard driving the cart didn't bother turning around. His voice carried the casual cruelty she'd grown accustomed to over the 3-day journey. Hope the Valewood Alpha likes his prizes damaged. You're looking a bit worse for wear. Lyra said nothing. She'd learned quickly that silence was safer than words. Every time she'd tried to speak, to ask for water, for a moment to relieve herself with dignity, for a blanket against the mountain cold, the guards had made her regret it. The bruise on her cheek still throbbed from the backhand she'd earned for requesting food the night before. My baby needs to eat, she'd said. Your baby belongs to the Valewood pack now, the guard had replied. Their problem, not ours. Through the bars, Lyra watched the landscape change. The familiar golden plains of Stormborn territory had given way to dense pine forests hours ago, the trees pressing close on either side of the road like silent sentinels. The air smelled different here, sharper, cleaner, carrying the bite of coming winter. Snow capped the distant peaks, and Lyra shivered in her thin dress. They'd stripped her of everything when they put her in the cage. Her warm cloak, her boots, her small bag of personal belongings. The only thing they'd left was the worn leather cord around her neck, holding a riverstone her father had given her before he died. For courage, he'd told her when she was 7, pressing the smooth gray stone into her palm. When you're afraid, hold this and remember that fear doesn't make you weak. What matters is what you do with it. She'd been holding it for 3 days straight. Her fingers knew every groove, every imperfection in its surface. It helped her breathe when panic clawed at her throat. The trees thinned ahead, and then the road crested a rise, and Lyra's breath caught. The Valewood fortress rose from the mountain like it had grown there, all dark stone and sharp angles softened by centuries of ivy climbing its walls. Towers pierced the gray sky, and the main gate stood open, revealing a courtyard larger than her entire village. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys, and even from this distance, Lyra could see people moving through the grounds, guards on the walls, servants crossing between buildings, a group of children chasing each other near what looked like a training yard. Children. Hope flickered in her chest, dangerous and unwelcome. A pack that allowed children to play freely couldn't be entirely monstrous. Could it? The cart rumbled through the gates, and the sound changed as wheels met cobblestone. Lyra pushed herself upright, ignoring the protest of muscles stiff from days of confinement. If she was going to meet her fate, she would do it standing. For courage. The courtyard fell silent as they passed. She felt the weight of dozens of eyes, curious, suspicious, pitying. A woman near the kitchens pressed her hand to her mouth. A guard muttered something to his companion that made them both shake their heads. The cart stopped. For a long moment, nothing happened. Lyra stood in her cage, her hand on her belly, her chin lifted despite the terror that turned her blood to ice. She would not cower. Whatever happened next, whatever they did to her, she would face it with her spine straight and her eyes open. Then the main doors of the fortress swung wide, and he emerged. Alpha King Marcus Valewood was enormous. That was Lyra's first coherent thought as she watched him descend the stone steps. He stood at least a head taller than any man she'd ever seen, his shoulders broad enough to block out the gray light behind him. Dark hair fell past his jaw, and a neatly trimmed beard shadowed a face that seemed carved from the same mountain stone as his fortress, all hard angles and harder eyes. He wore no crown, no ceremonial robes, just simple dark clothing that did nothing to diminish the raw power radiating from every line of his body. This was a man who didn't need symbols to prove his authority. His presence alone was enough to make every wolf in the courtyard lower their eyes. Every wolf except Lyra. She met his gaze across the cobblestones, and the world tilted beneath her feet. Heat flooded her chest like molten honey spreading through her veins, pooling low in her belly before racing outward to her fingertips. Her skin prickled with sudden, overwhelming awareness. The cold she'd been fighting for 3 days vanished, replaced by warmth that bordered on fever. What? His sharp inhale echoed across the courtyard. Even from this distance, she saw the change in him, the way his massive frame went rigid, the way his hands curled into fists at his sides. Gold bled into his dark irises, slow and inevitable as sunrise, until those hard eyes blazed with amber fire. No. Her wolf surged against her skin, snarling in recognition of something her mind rejected utterly. No, this isn't possible. He can't be... Mate. The word thundered through her blood, drowning out thought, drowning out reason. Her wolf pressed forward with a desperate whine, demanding acknowledgement of something Lyra couldn't accept. The Alpha King who'd bought her like cattle, the enemy who held her fate in his massive hands, the monster her pack had whispered about around dying fires. Mate. He took one step toward the cage, then another, each footfall deliberate and heavy on the cobblestones. His eyes never left hers. The gold in them burned brighter with every step, and Lyra felt an answering heat rise in her own chest, her wolf responding to his call, despite everything her mind screamed about survival, about trust, about the impossibility of fate choosing this moment to bind her to this man. Open it. His voice came out rough, scraped raw by something that looked like shock. Now! The guards scrambled to obey, fumbling with the iron lock that had held her prisoner. The cage door swung wide with a shriek of rusted hinges, and Lyra stood at the threshold, suddenly unable to move. His scent hit her first, pine and winter storms, wood smoke and something darker beneath, something wild and ancient that made her wolf howl with recognition. Her knees nearly buckled from the force of the bond snapping into place, an invisible cord stretching between them, pulling her toward him with a need that defied everything she thought she knew about herself. She gripped the cage bars to stay upright, and Marcus Valewood's gaze dropped to her white-knuckled fingers, then to her swollen belly, then back to her face. Something shifted in his expression. The gold in his eyes didn't fade, but the predatory intensity softened into something else, something that looked almost like wonder. "You're pregnant," he said quietly. "Yes." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "If that changes the terms of the treaty, you'll need to take it up with Alpha Hendricks. I'm sure he'll offer you a replacement tribute." A muscle ticked in his jaw. "You think I would send you back?" "I think I don't know what you would do. I know nothing about you except that my pack sold me to you like livestock and loaded me into this cage 3 days ago without food or water or a coat against the cold." Lyra lifted her chin higher. "I know that my child and I are at your mercy. I know that mercy has been in short supply lately." For a long moment, the Alpha King just looked at her. The courtyard held its breath. Then Marcus Valewood extended his hand, not grabbing, not demanding, just offering. "Come out of the cage, Lyra Stormborn." He said her name like he was tasting it, learning the shape of it on his tongue. "Whatever you've been told about me, whatever you expect, I swear on my bloodline that no harm will come to you in my territory. Not from me, not from anyone. She stared at his outstretched palm, calloused fingers, steady and patient, waiting for her to choose. Her wolf urged her forward, but Lyra hesitated. Trust was a wound that hadn't healed yet. Trust was the knife her own pack had used to cut her open. But what choice did she have? She stepped out of the cage and took the Alpha King's hand. His fingers closed around hers, warm and impossibly gentle, and the bond between them hummed with something that felt terrifyingly like hope. His hand was warm. That was what Lyra's mind kept circling back to as Marcus Valewood led her across the courtyard, her fingers still wrapped in his careful grip. After 3 days of iron cold seeping into her bones, after nights spent shivering against metal bars with nothing but her own arms for warmth, the simple heat of his palm against hers felt like stepping into sunlight. She hated how much she wanted to lean into it. The bond hummed between them, a low vibration that seemed to resonate in her very marrow. Every step brought a new wave of sensation, awareness prickling along her spine when his thumb shifted against her knuckles, warmth pooling in her chest when he adjusted his pace to match her slower one, a sharp tug behind her ribs when he glanced down at her with those gold-touched eyes. This isn't real, she told herself. The mate bond is just biology, instinct. It doesn't mean he's safe. But her wolf disagreed. Her wolf pressed against her skin with an urgency she'd never felt before, demanding acknowledgement of what every cell in her body already knew. This man, this Alpha King who'd bought her as tribute, who held the power of life and death over her and her child, was her mate. The other half of her soul, if the old stories were to be believed. The old stories had never mentioned what happened when fate chose someone you had every reason to fear. Lyra. His voice pulled her from her spiraling thoughts. She looked up to find him watching her, his brow furrowed with something that might have been concern. You're shaking. She hadn't noticed until he said it, but now she felt it. The fine tremor running through her limbs, whether from cold or exhaustion or the overwhelming strangeness of this moment. She couldn't tell. Maybe all three. I'm fine, she said automatically. You're not. He didn't say it like an accusation. Just a fact, stated simply. When did you last eat? The question caught her off guard. Alpha Hendrix had never asked her such things. To him, Omegas existed to serve, not to need. I don't... She tried to remember. Before the cage, there had been a thin gruel that morning, barely enough to quiet her stomach. And before that? 3 days, I think. Maybe longer. Something dangerous flickered across his face. The gold in his eyes brightened. And for a heartbeat, Lyra saw the wolf beneath the man's skin, ancient and furious and barely contained. Then he breathed out slowly, and the wildness banked to embers. Come. His grip on her hand gentled further, as if she were something fragile he feared breaking. You need food and rest. The healer will need to examine you. Make sure the journey hasn't harmed. His gaze dropped to her belly, and that strange expression crossed his face again. Wonder mixed with something Lyra couldn't name. Make sure you're both well. He led her up the stone steps and through the great doors, into an entrance hall that made her breath catch. Vaulted ceilings arched overhead, supported by pillars carved with running wolves. Tapestries depicting forest scenes lined the walls. Hunts and gatherings, packs running beneath full moons. Despite its grandeur, the space felt warm, lived in. Not the cold monument to power she'd expected. Servants appeared as they walked, bowing low to their Alpha King, but Lyra noticed how their eyes lingered on her with curiosity rather than contempt. One young woman, hardly more than a girl, offered her a tentative smile before scurrying away. You'll need new clothes, Marcus said as they climbed a wide staircase. Warm ones, and a proper meal. I'll have the kitchens prepare whatever you want. You don't have to. I want to. He stopped on the landing, turning to face her fully. This close, she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes, and the sheer size of him should have been terrifying. An alpha king in his prime, built like a fortress himself, with the power to crush her with one hand. Instead, he stood 3 feet away, giving her space, his posture carefully unthreatening despite the obvious tension in his shoulders. "I know what you must think of me," he said quietly. "What you've heard about the Valewood Pack, about what I do to those who challenge me. Some of it is even true." A muscle jumped in his jaw. "But I have never raised my hand against a woman. I have never forced myself on anyone. And I will never hurt you or your child. Do you understand?" Her wolf urged her to believe him, to lean into the bond and accept the protection it offered. But Lyra had believed before. She'd believed her mother would defend her, believed her packmates would speak up, believed the healer who'd promised to keep her secret. "I understand that you're saying the right things," she said carefully. "But words are easy. My former alpha spoke kindly to me once too, before he sold me." She expected anger. The alphas she'd known didn't tolerate being questioned, especially not by omegas, especially not by pregnant, powerless omegas who'd been handed to them as tribute. But Marcus Valewood just nodded slowly, as if her distrust made perfect sense. "Then I'll show you instead," he said, "as many times as you need, for as long as it takes." He resumed walking, and after a moment's hesitation, Lyra followed. The suite he led her to was larger than the house she'd grown up in. A sitting room with plush furniture arranged before a roaring fireplace gave way to a bedroom dominated by a massive bed piled high with furs and quilts. Through an archway, she glimpsed a bathing chamber with a copper tub large enough to swim in. "These are the Luna's quarters," Marcus said, and something in his voice made her look at him sharply. "They've stood empty for a long time. If the arrangement doesn't please you, I can find somewhere else. But these rooms are the most comfortable in the fortress, and they adjoin my own chambers should you need." He stopped himself, a faint flush climbing his neck. "Should you need anything? Assistance? Protection." Luna's quarters. Rooms meant for the alpha's mate. Lyra's hand drifted to her belly. "You're giving the Luna's chambers to a pregnant tribute from an enemy pack?" "I'm giving them to my mate." The word fell between them like a stone into still water, rippling outward. "Unless you want me to pretend that's not what you are, that I didn't feel my entire world shift the moment I looked into your eyes." Her breath caught. She'd expected him to circle around it, to treat the bond as leverage or inconvenience, not to acknowledge it so directly, with that raw honesty in his voice. "I don't know what I want," she admitted. "I don't know what to think about any of this. 12 hours ago, I was in a cage, certain I was going to die, or worse. Now you're telling me we're mates, giving me rooms meant for a queen, and I—" She pressed her hand harder against her belly. "The baby isn't yours. You understand that, don't you? Whatever the bond says, I'm carrying another man's child." The words came out harsh, almost a challenge. Let him react to that. Let him show his true colors when confronted with the reality of what she was. Used goods, soiled, carrying the seed of someone else. But Marcus only tilted his head, studying her with those unreadable gold-flecked eyes. "I know," he said simply. "And it doesn't bother you? Should it?" She let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "It would bother most alphas. Children are legacy, bloodline, and alpha's heirs are supposed to be his own. The child growing inside you is innocent." His voice was quiet but firm. "They didn't ask to be conceived, didn't choose the circumstances of their creation, and they're part of you, which makes them precious to me whether we share blood or not." The words hit her like a physical blow. Lyra felt her eyes sting with tears she refused to shed, her throat tightening around a sob she wouldn't release. No one had ever said anything like that to her. No one had ever looked at her pregnancy as anything other than shame, scandal, weakness. "You don't even know me," she whispered. I will, he said, and it sounded like a promise. If you let me. Before she could respond, a knock sounded at the door. Marcus moved to answer it, his body positioning itself automatically between her and the entrance, protecting her from a potential threat without conscious thought. Her wolf noticed, filing the detail away. A woman in healer's robes stood in the doorway, gray-streaked hair pulled back from a kind, weathered face. She carried a leather bag that clinked softly with the movement of bottles inside. You sent for me, my king? This is Miriam, Marcus told Lyra, stepping aside to let the healer enter. She's attended every birth in the Valewood Pack for 30 years. She'll examine you, make sure you and the baby are healthy after your journey. Lyra stiffened. The last healer she'd trusted had betrayed her for silver. Miriam must have seen something in her face because she approached slowly, hands visible and empty, the way one might approach a wounded animal. I know that look, the older woman said gently. Someone in my profession hurt you, betrayed your trust. She sold my secret to my alpha, Lyra heard herself say, for a promotion and a pouch of coins. Miriam's expression hardened with something that looked like genuine anger. Then she violated her oaths and her calling. A healer's first duty is to protect those in their care, no matter the cost. She met Lyra's eyes steadily. I've kept secrets that could have toppled kingdoms. I've lied to my own alpha when the truth would have endangered my patients. What you tell me stays between us, unless you choose otherwise. You have my word. Lyra wanted to believe her. The exhaustion of 3 days in a cage, the overwhelming confusion of the mate bond, the desperate hope that kept trying to spark in her chest despite everything, all of it pressed against her defenses, urging her to accept help while it was offered. She looked at Marcus, who had retreated to the far side of the room, giving them space. He leaned against the wall with his arms crossed, but his posture was watchful, ready to intervene if needed. Do you want me to leave? He asked, as if reading her thoughts. She didn't know what she wanted, but the healer needed to examine her, and the idea of being alone with a stranger, even a kind-seeming one, made her wolf bristle. Stay, please. His expression softened. Of course. Miriam examined her with gentle efficiency, her hands warm and skilled as she checked Lyra's pulse, listened to the baby's heartbeat with a strange horn-shaped instrument, pressed carefully along her belly to feel the position of the child. 4 months along? She asked. Yes, maybe a little more. The healer nodded, making notes on a small pad. The baby is strong. Good positioning, healthy heartbeat. You're malnourished and dehydrated, which will fix immediately, but there's no lasting damage that I can see. Her brow furrowed as she examined the bruise on Lyra's cheek, the chafing on her wrists from the cage bars. These need tending. The cheek especially. It's deep enough to scar if we don't treat it properly. It doesn't matter, Lyra said automatically. What was one more scar? It matters. Marcus's voice came from across the room, low and rough. When she looked at him, the gold had returned to his eyes, bright with barely contained fury. Who did this to you? One of the guards. I asked for food. The silence that followed was absolute. Marcus's hands curled into fists at his sides, and she watched him wage some internal war, the wolf demanding blood, the man trying to maintain control. Which guard? Each word emerged clipped, precise. I don't know his name. Then describe him. Marcus. Miriam spoke sharply, a familiarity in her tone that suggested long acquaintance. She needs rest and food, not an interrogation. The men who hurt her are back in Stormborn territory. Beyond your reach. For now. The Alpha King's jaw tightened, but he nodded once. A short, jerky motion. For now, he repeated, and the promise of future reckoning hung in the air. Miriam finished her examination and left a collection of small bottles on the side table. Vitamins, she explained, and a salve for the bruises, and tea that would help her sleep. Then she departed with a gentle reminder to call if Lyra needed anything, day or night. The door closed and Lyra was alone with her mate. Marcus moved to the fireplace, adding another log to the flames. Sparks rose and scattered like tiny stars. "Food will arrive shortly," he said, without turning around. "I've ordered them to bring variety. I don't know what you like, what you can stomach with the pregnancy. Eat what appeals to you and leave the rest. You're being very careful with me." "Yes." "Why?" He turned then, firelight painting half his face in gold while the other half remained in shadow. "Because someone should have been careful with you long ago, and no one was. Because you're carrying a child and you've been starved and caged and beaten for the crime of existing. Because you're my mate." His voice caught slightly on the word. "And the thought of you in pain makes me want to tear the world apart." Her wolf pressed forward eagerly, but Lyra held her back. It was too much, too fast. She needed time to think, to process, to figure out what was real and what was just the bond talking. "I'm tired," she said. And it wasn't a lie. Bone-deep exhaustion pulled at her limbs, made her eyelids heavy. "Then sleep." Marcus moved toward the door. "I'll be in the next room if you need me. You're safe here, Lyra. I swear it." He paused at the threshold, looking back at her one last time. In the firelight, with his eyes still touched with gold and his expression impossibly gentle for a man of his size and power, he looked almost vulnerable. Then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him, leaving her alone in the Luna's chambers with the crackle of the fire and the impossible weight of everything that had changed in a single afternoon. She made it to the bed before her legs gave out, sinking into the soft mattress with a gasp of something between relief and disbelief. The furs were warm against her cold skin. The pillows smelled faintly of lavender. Her hand found her belly, feeling the familiar flutter of her baby moving. "We're safe," she thought, testing the words carefully. "For now, we're safe." But even as exhaustion dragged her toward sleep, a small voice whispered in the back of her mind, "For how long?" Lyra woke to the sound of voices. Not loud. Not the kind of shouting that had preceded violence in Stormborn territory, but the low murmur of conversation drifting through the door that connected her chambers to Marcus's. She lay still beneath the furs, her hand automatically finding her belly, her heart hammering as she tried to orient herself. The fire had burned down to embers. Gray morning light filtered through the heavy curtains. She must have slept through the night, the first real sleep she'd had in days, dreamless and deep. Her body ached less than it had yesterday, though her cheek still throbbed where the guard's fist had connected. The voices grew clearer as she pushed herself upright against the pillows. "Arrived an hour ago. He's insisting on a formal audience." A man's voice, unfamiliar, crisp with tension. "At dawn?" Marcus's response came as a low rumble that vibrated through the wall and settled somewhere in Lyra's chest. What possible justification? "He claims urgent diplomatic matters. Something about the northern borders and trade routes." A pause. When Marcus spoke again, his voice had dropped to something colder. "Alpha Brennan Starfall doesn't give a damn about trade routes. He's here because word travels fast and he wants to see for himself." "See what?" "That I've found my mate." Lyra's breath caught. She pressed her palm flat against her belly, feeling her baby shift in response to her sudden spike of fear. Alpha Brennan Starfall. She knew that name. Every wolf in the region knew that name. The Starfall pack controlled the northern mountains, their territory wrapping around the Valewood borders like a predator circling prey. Brennan himself had a reputation for ruthless ambition, for taking what he wanted regardless of treaties or tradition. And he was here. Now. Because of her. "Should I turn him away?" the unfamiliar voice asked. "No." Marcus's response came swift and sharp. That would only confirm whatever suspicions he's nursing. We'll receive him properly. Have the Great Hall prepared. And the woman? A longer pause this time. Lyra strained to hear, her wolf pressing forward with anxious energy. She stays in her chambers, under guard. I don't want Brennan anywhere near her until I understand what game he's playing. Footsteps retreated. A door opened and closed. Then silence. Until the connecting door swung inward and Marcus filled the frame, his dark hair tousled from sleep, his jaw tight with concern. You heard? He said. Not a question. Lyra nodded slowly, pulling the furs higher around her shoulders. Alpha Starfall, he's dangerous. You know of him? Everyone knows of him. He's been trying to expand his territory for years. There were rumors. She hesitated, old memories surfacing. Rumors that he approached Alpha Hendrix about an alliance, marriage to one of the Stormborn daughters to seal the deal. Marcus went very still. And? Hendrix refused. Said Brennan's price was too high. He wanted military support for his expansion, and Hendrix didn't want to get pulled into a war he couldn't win. Her hand moved unconsciously to the river stone at her throat. That was before my father died. Before everything changed. Before Hendrix sold you to buy peace with me instead. The words hung between them. Marcus crossed the room in 3 strides, crouching beside the bed so they were eye level. This close, she could see the gold flecks in his dark irises, could smell the pine and storm scent of him cutting through her lingering fear. Brennan Starfall has been circling my borders for years, Marcus said quietly. Looking for weakness, looking for opportunity. A mated Alpha King is stronger than an unmated one, but an Alpha King with an unclaimed mate? His jaw tightened. That's vulnerability, a pressure point. Understanding dawned cold in Lyra's chest. He's here to see if you've claimed me. He's here to see if there's an opening, if he can drive a wedge between us, steal you away, force a challenge. Marcus's hands curled into fists against the bedding. He won't succeed. I won't let him near you. You can't keep me hidden forever. I can try. Despite everything, the fear, the uncertainty, the bond still raw and new between them, something in Lyra warmed at the fierce protectiveness in his voice. Her wolf pressed against her ribs, wanting to lean toward him, to close the distance, to accept the safety he was offering. But the baby shifted again, a reminder of everything at stake, and she held herself still. What happens now? She asked. Marcus rose, his expression settling into the hard mask of the Alpha King. Now I go find out what Brennan really wants. And you stay here, eat breakfast, and don't open this door for anyone except Miriam or me. Understood? She nodded. He started toward the connecting door, then paused, looking back at her over his shoulder. I meant what I said last night, Lyra. You're safe here. I will burn this world to ashes before I let anyone hurt you again. Then he was gone, and she was alone with the embers of the dying fire and the weight of his promise settling around her like armor. The morning stretched long and tense. Miriam came with breakfast, more food than Lyra could possibly eat, arranged on silver trays with obvious care, and stayed to check her injuries and administer more of the vitamin supplements. The healer's weathered face was carefully neutral, but Lyra caught the worried glances she cast toward the window, toward the sounds of activity in the courtyard below. There's a visitor, Lyra said. Alpha Starfall. Miriam's hands stilled on the salve jar. You shouldn't concern yourself with pack politics. Not in your condition. My condition is exactly why I should concern myself. Lyra set down the bread she'd been eating, her appetite suddenly gone. If something happens to Marcus, nothing will happen to the Alpha King. But there was a thread of uncertainty beneath Miriam's firm tone. He's the strongest wolf in 5 territories. Brennan Starfall wouldn't dare challenge him directly. And indirectly? The healer's silence was answer enough. After Miriam left, Lyra found herself pacing the length of the Luna's chambers, restless energy building beneath her skin. The rooms were beautiful, more beautiful than anywhere she'd lived in Stormborn territory, but the walls felt close, the air thick with her own anxiety. Her wolf paced with her, a mirror of her agitation, straining toward the bond that connected her to Marcus. She could feel him, distantly, like catching a scent on the wind. There was tension in the bond, controlled anger, the careful calculation of a predator assessing a threat. She pressed her palm to her chest, over her heart, and tried to send something back. Reassurance, maybe, or solidarity. But the connection was too new, too fragile. She didn't know how to use it. A knock at the door made her freeze. "Lady Lyra?" A woman's voice, unfamiliar. "The Alpha King requests your presence in the Great Hall." Her heart stuttered. Marcus had told her to stay hidden. Had something changed? "Who are you?" she called, moving toward the door but not opening it. A pause. "My name is Vera. I serve in the Alpha's household." Lyra's wolf growled a warning, hackles rising. Something felt wrong. The timing, the formality of the request, the way her instinct screamed at her to stay behind the locked door. "The Alpha King told me to stay here," she said carefully. "He'll come for me himself when he's ready." Another pause, longer this time, then footsteps retreating, quick and light. Lyra pressed her back against the wall, her hand over her racing heart, and didn't breathe normally again until she heard Marcus's voice in the corridor outside, sharp with alarm. "What do you mean?" Someone tried to summon her. The connecting door burst open. Marcus strode through, his eyes blazing gold, his chest heaving like he'd run the whole way. Behind him, she glimpsed two guards with drawn weapons. "Lyra." He crossed to her in two strides, his hands cupping her face, his gaze searching hers. "Are you hurt? Did anyone—" "I'm fine. I didn't open the door." She was trembling, she realized. His touch was warm against her cold skin. Who was she? The woman? "We don't know yet." His jaw tightened. "She was gone by the time my guards arrived, but I can guess who sent her." "Brennan." He denied any involvement, of course. Claimed his people have been with him all morning. Marcus's thumb traced gently over her uninjured cheek, the gesture almost unconscious. "But the timing is too convenient. He wanted to see you. Wanted to assess the bond, see if there was an opening he could exploit. And when he couldn't get to me directly, he tested our defenses, probed for weaknesses." Marcus's voice dropped to a low growl. "He won't find any." Lyra looked up at him, at the fierce protectiveness burning in his gold-touched eyes, at the barely contained fury vibrating through his massive frame, and felt something shift in her chest. Not her wolf, though her wolf was pressing forward eagerly. Something deeper. Something that had been locked away for so long she'd forgotten it existed. Trust. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now you don't leave my sight until that snake is off my territory." Marcus's hand slid from her face to her shoulders, then down her arms, as if reassuring himself that she was real and whole and present. "I've dismissed his diplomatic requests. He leaves within the hour. He won't be happy about that. I don't care about his happiness. I care about your safety." The words settled over her like a warm blanket. Her wolf hummed with contentment, pressing against her skin, urging her to close the distance between them. For once, Lyra didn't fight the impulse. She stepped forward, letting her forehead rest against Marcus's chest, feeling the steady thunder of his heartbeat beneath her cheek. His arms came around her immediately, careful not to squeeze too tight, mindful of her injuries and her belly and all the fragile parts of her that had been broken and were only beginning to heal. "I've got you," he murmured against her hair. "I've got you both." They stood that way for a long moment. Lyra pressed against his warmth, Marcus wrapped around her like a shield against the world. and for the first time since her father died, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone anymore. 3 days passed. 3 days of Marcus shadowing her every movement, of guards stationed at every door, of the entire Valewood pack on high alert. Alpha Brennan Starfall had departed as ordered, his carriage rolling out through the main gates with an escort of Marcus's most trusted warriors to ensure he actually left the territory. But Lyra couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. "You're thinking too loudly," Marcus said from across the dinner table. They'd taken to eating together in his private study, away from the curious eyes of the pack. It was easier this way. Less formal, less overwhelming for Lyra, who was still adjusting to the idea of being anyone of importance. "I'm thinking at a normal volume," she countered, pushing a piece of roasted meat around her plate. "You're just learning to hear it." His lips twitched. Almost a smile, though she'd learned he wasn't a man given to easy expressions of joy. "The bond is strengthening. Is that what this is?" She set down her fork, meeting his gaze. "I woke up this morning and I knew you were already awake, even though I couldn't hear you. I knew you were troubled. I knew—" She hesitated. "I knew you were thinking about me." Gold flickered through his irises. "I'm always thinking about you." The confession, so baldly stated, sent warmth flooding through her chest. Her wolf purred with satisfaction, pressing against her ribs, urging her to reach across the table, to touch him, to strengthen this impossible connection that was growing between them. She didn't reach out. Not yet. But she didn't look away either. "Tell me about Brennan," she said instead. "The real history, not the rumors." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting into something harder. "Our fathers were allies once, before the territory wars, before everything turned bloody." He paused, shadows crossing his face. "Brennan was supposed to marry my sister." Lyra's breath caught. "I didn't know you had a sister." "I don't. Not anymore." His hands curled into fists on the table. "She died 3 years ago. A hunting accident, the official story says. But I've always suspected—" He shook his head, a sharp motion. "I could never prove anything. Brennan was careful. He always is." "You think he killed her?" "I think Elena refused him. Publicly. Humiliatingly. And I think Brennan is the kind of man who never forgets a slight." Marcus's gaze found hers, fierce and protective. "Which is why you need to understand. This isn't just about territory or politics. This is personal for him. You're my mate. Taking you would be revenge and strategic advantage wrapped into one neat package." A chill ran down Lyra's spine. Her hand dropped to her belly, protective instinct surging through her. "He can't have me," she said quietly. "And he can't have my child." "No." Marcus rose from his chair, circling the table until he stood before her. He reached down, his calloused fingers tilting her chin up until their eyes met. "He can't. I will tear out his throat with my bare hands before I let him touch either of you." The words should have frightened her. Would have, weeks ago. But something had shifted in the days since her arrival. She'd watched Marcus train with his warriors, fierce and dominant, but never cruel. She'd seen him gentle the young wolves who approached him with questions, patient where she expected impatience. She'd felt his careful tenderness every time he touched her, asking permission with his eyes before closing any distance. This was not a monster. This was a man who had been alone for too long, who had lost too much, who had been given an impossible gift in the form of a mate he hadn't expected or asked for. And she was starting to want to be that gift for him. "Marcus," she said softly, and watched his pupils dilate at the sound of his name in her mouth. "I—" A horn blast shattered the moment, then another, then a third. 3 sharp notes that made Marcus's head snap toward the window, his entire body going rigid. What is that? Lyra demanded, rising to her feet. Intruders at the border. His voice had gone cold, flat, all trace of softness vanished. Multiple wolves, coming fast. Another horn blast. Marcus was already moving toward the door, but he paused at the threshold, looking back at her with golden eyes blazing in a face carved from stone. Stay here. Lock the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone. Anyone except you, or Miriam, I know. She moved toward him, catching his hand before he could leave. Be careful. Something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, or that painful hope she'd glimpsed before. He raised her hand to his lips, pressing a fierce kiss against her knuckles. Wait for me, he said. Then he was gone, his footsteps thundering down the corridor, and Lyra was alone with her pounding heart and the terrible certainty that Brennan Starfall had only been waiting for the right moment to strike. The horn blasts faded into silence, but the quiet that followed was worse. Lyra pressed her palm flat against the study door, straining to hear anything. Footsteps, voices, the clash of battle. But the thick stone walls swallowed all sound. Wait for me, Marcus had said. She was trying. But every instinct screamed that something was wrong. Her wolf paced beneath her skin, agitated in a way that had nothing to do with the bond and everything to do with survival. The baby shifted in her belly, responding to her elevated heartbeat, and Lyra forced herself to take a steadying breath. Think. Don't panic. Think. The horn blasts had come from the border. Marcus and his warriors would be racing toward the threat, leaving the fortress defended but not impenetrable. If Brennan was as cunning as Marcus believed, if he'd spent years probing for weaknesses, he wouldn't launch a frontal assault. He would use the distraction. The realization hit her like ice water. This wasn't an attack. It was a diversion. Lyra's hand dropped from the door to her belly, protective instinct flaring hot and fierce. She needed to find somewhere more defensible, somewhere with multiple exits, somewhere. The lock clicked. She stumbled backward, her heart slamming against her ribs. The door swung inward, and Alpha Brennan Starfall stepped into the study with a smile that didn't reach his pale eyes. Hello, little Omega. He closed the door behind him, the click of the lock echoing through the room like a death knell. Did you really think a locked door would keep me out? Lyra's back hit the desk. She gripped its edge, knuckles white, refusing to let her voice shake. Marcus will kill you for this. Marcus is currently 3 miles away, chasing shadows. Brennan moved deeper into the room, his steps unhurried, predatory. He was smaller than Marcus. Most wolves were. But he carried himself with the confidence of a man who had never been denied anything he wanted. By the time he realizes the intruders at his border were just a handful of rogues paid to make noise, we'll be long gone. I'm not going anywhere with you. You don't have a choice. His smile sharpened. Your former alpha was a fool, you know. When I approached him about an alliance, my warriors in exchange for your hand and Stormborn's military support, he refused. Said you were worthless, not even worth the breeding he'd eventually put you to. Brennan's gaze dropped to her swollen belly, and something ugly flickered in his expression. He was wrong. An unbonded mate to the Alpha King, a child that could be raised as my puppet heir to the Valewood throne, you're worth more than entire territories. Lyra's blood ran cold. The baby kicked against her palm, and she curved her body protectively around the swell of her stomach. The bond is forming. I'm not unbonded. Forming isn't finished. Brennan reached into his coat and withdrew a small glass vial filled with dark liquid. This is what killed Marcus's guards at the North Watchtower. Slow-acting poison. They'll be dead within the hour, and without the antidote, so will anyone else who drank from the diplomatic wine I so generously provided. His smile widened at her horrified gasp. Oh yes, the entire War Council shared a toast before riding out, Marcus included. No. Her wolf howled, throwing itself against her skin with desperate fury. The bond, fragile, still forming, pulsed with sudden, terrible awareness. She could feel Marcus, distant but present, and beneath the steady strength of his presence, something was wrong. A weakness spreading through the connection like rot. "You're lying," she whispered. "Am I?" Brennan tucked the vial back into his coat. "Come with me quietly, and I might be persuaded to leave the antidote where someone can find it. Fight me, and your mate dies choking on his own blood while you watch from my carriage window." Lyra's mind raced. The antidote was in his coat. Marcus was poisoned. The guards were dead or dying. She was alone, pregnant, facing a wolf who had likely murdered Marcus's sister for the crime of refusing him. She had no weapons, no training, no pack to call for help. But she had the bond. Marcus. She threw everything she had into the connection, not words, but feeling. Desperate, terrified, burning love she hadn't known she was capable of. "Marcus, please. He's here. He's—" Brennan's hand closed around her arm, and Lyra did the only thing she could think of. She bit him. Her teeth sank into the meat of his forearm, tearing through fabric and flesh until copper flooded her mouth. Brennan roared, backhanding her hard enough to send her crashing into the desk, but she'd bought herself seconds, precious seconds, while he clutched his bleeding arm and snarled curses. Lyra scrambled across the floor, her vision swimming from the blow, her cheek screaming where his ring had split the skin. The vial. She needed the vial. Brennan's coat had fallen open when he'd struck her, and she could see the glass glinting in his inner pocket. The door exploded inward. Marcus came through the shattered wood half-shifted, his eyes blazing pure gold, his face contorted into something barely human. Blood streaked his temple and soaked through his shirt at the shoulder, but he moved like the wound didn't exist, like nothing existed except the threat standing between him and his mate. "You," he snarled, and the single word carried enough rage to shake the walls. Brennan whirled, drawing a blade from his belt, but Marcus was already on him. They crashed together in a tangle of claws and fury, the desk splintering beneath them as they hit the ground. Lyra didn't hesitate. She threw herself toward Brennan's fallen coat, her fingers closing around the vial of dark liquid. Wrong. That's the poison. And then finding a second vial. This one filled with something clear. The antidote. It had to be. Marcus had Brennan pinned against the ruined desk, claws at his throat, but his movements were slower than they should have been. Sluggish. The poison was working through his system, weakening him, and Brennan saw it too. His bloody smile returned. "You're dying," Brennan laughed, wet and triumphant. "Can you feel it? Crawling through your veins? You'll be dead before—" "Guards!" Lyra screamed, lunging toward the shattered doorway. Two warriors appeared in the corridor, wide-eyed and armed. She shoved the clear vial into the nearest guard's hands. "The War Council was poisoned. This is the antidote. Go." The guard took one look at his alpha, bleeding and struggling to maintain his grip on the enemy wolf, and ran. Lyra turned back to find Marcus's claws buried in Brennan's shoulders, pinning him to the ground. But his arms were shaking. His face had gone gray beneath the golden glow of his eyes. "You touched what is mine," Marcus snarled, his voice raw with the effort of staying conscious. Brennan laughed again, blood bubbling at his lips from a wound Lyra couldn't see. "She's unclaimed. Fair game. You know the old laws as well as I do." Lyra stepped forward, her wolf pressed against her skin, not with fear anymore, but with something older, fiercer, the same protective fury that had driven her to bite, to fight, to survive. "I was never yours to take," she said, her voice steady despite the blood running down her cheek. "Not Hendricks. Not yours. Never yours." Marcus looked up at her, his mate, small and pregnant and covered in her own blood, standing over him with fire in her eyes, and something like wonder crossed his face. Even dying, even fighting to maintain his grip on the wolf who had tormented him for years. He looked at her like she was the most magnificent thing he'd ever seen. Lyra, he rasped. She understood. This was her choice. Her say in the fate of the wolf who had threatened her child, her mate, everything she was only beginning to hope she might have. Do it, she said. Marcus's claws tore through Brennan Starfall's throat. The alpha died with his eyes wide and surprised, like he'd never truly believed he could lose. His body went limp beneath Marcus's hands, blood pooling across the stone floor. And then, it was over. The threat that had hung over them since Lyra's arrival, the shadow that had darkened Marcus's reign for years, bled out on the study floor. Marcus swayed. Lyra caught him before he could fall, her arms going around his shoulders, her hands pressing against the wound at his temple. He was too heavy for her to hold upright, but she managed to guide his collapse until he was sitting against the ruined desk, his head tipped back, his chest heaving. The antidote, he managed. The guards. They have it. They're going to the War Council now. Lyra cupped his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. Stay awake, Marcus. Stay with me. Hard to leave, he murmured, a ghost of a smile crossing his gray lips. You're too stubborn. Would just follow me and drag me back. I would, she agreed, tears burning her eyes. So don't make me. His hand found hers, fingers lacing together despite the blood coating both of them. Bossy Omega. Ridiculous Alpha. He laughed, a weak, rasping sound, and then his eyes fluttered closed. Number. Lyra's wolf howled, and she felt the bond strain between them, fragile and new and not enough. She couldn't lose him. Not now, not when they'd barely begun, not when she'd finally found something worth fighting for. The healer arrived, Miriam, her weathered face pale with fear, and pushed Lyra gently aside to work on Marcus. More guards came, clearing Brennan's body, securing the corridor. Someone pressed a cloth to Lyra's cheek, murmuring about stitches. She didn't hear any of it. She sat beside Marcus on the blood-soaked floor, his hand clasped in both of hers, and poured every ounce of hope and terror and desperate love into the bond between them. Come back to me. Come back to us. Please. Marcus woke 3 hours later. Lyra was there when his eyes opened, had refused to leave his bedside despite Miriam's protests that she needed rest, that stress wasn't good for the baby, that the Alpha King would be furious if he woke to find his mate exhausted and pale from a vigil she didn't need to keep. He'll be more furious if he wakes alone, Lyra had said, and that had ended the argument. His first words were her name, not a question, not a demand, just Lyra, spoken like a prayer, like the answer to every doubt that had ever plagued him. I'm here, she whispered, leaning over him. I'm here. The antidote worked. The War Council is safe. Brennan is dead. His hand lifted, trembling but sure, to cup her face. His thumb traced the bandage on her cheek where his healer had stitched the cut from Brennan's ring. He hurt you. He tried. You stopped him. You stopped him. His eyes searched hers, still threaded with gold but clearer now, more focused. I felt you. Through the bond. You called to me, and I felt it like a hook in my chest, dragging me back from the border. I knew you were in danger. I knew. His voice broke. I knew you would come. Lyra turned her face to press a kiss against his palm. I trusted you. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Trust. The thing she'd told herself she would never offer again. The thing he'd earned, piece by careful piece, in every gentle touch and quiet promise. Marcus sat up despite her protests, pulling her into his arms with a desperation that made her throat tight. She went willingly, climbing onto the bed beside him, letting him tuck her against his chest until she could hear the steady thunder of his heartbeat beneath her ear. I almost lost you, he said into her hair. You didn't. But I almost... Marcus. She pulled back enough to meet his eyes. You didn't. We're both here. We survived. His gaze dropped to her belly, to the child growing safely beneath her heart, and some of the tension drained from his shoulders. Both of you? Both of us. She took his hand and pressed it flat against her stomach, letting him feel the gentle flutter of movement beneath his palm. All three of us. Something broke open in his face. The carefully controlled alpha, the fierce king, the man who had built walls around his heart after losing his sister, all of it cracked apart, and what emerged was raw and vulnerable, and so full of hope it hurt to look at. Stay, he whispered. I was never leaving. He kissed her then, soft and reverent, and Lyra felt the bond between them pulse with golden warmth. It was still new, still fragile, but it was theirs, built from terror and trust and the impossible miracle of finding each other. When they finally pulled apart, Marcus's eyes had gone fully gold. His wolf looked out through them, ancient and patient and utterly certain of what came next. I want to claim you, he said, his voice rough, properly, before the pack and the moon and whatever gods are watching. His thumb stroked across her pulse point where the mate mark would sit. But only if you want it, only if you're ready. Lyra thought about everything that had led her here. The cage, the fear, the slow, careful way Marcus had dismantled every expectation she'd carried about what it meant to belong to someone. I want it, she said. I want you. His sharp inhale sent heat pooling low in her belly. His hands trembled as they slid up her arms to cup her shoulders, and she realized with wonder that this massive, powerful alpha was nervous. Tell me if I hurt you, he murmured against her throat. Tell me if you need me to stop. I will. His teeth grazed her pulse point. A question, a promise, a warning, and then he bit down. Pain flared, sharp and bright, but it transformed almost immediately into something else. Warmth cascaded through her body like honey catching fire, spreading from the place where his teeth marked her outward to every nerve ending she possessed. She gasped, her fingers digging into his shoulders as the bond between them ripped wide open. Everything. She felt everything. His loneliness, years of it, stretching back to the day he'd buried his sister. His fierce protectiveness, born from loss and hardened by duty. His terrified hope when he'd first caught her scent in the courtyard, the impossible recognition of mate colliding with the reality of her circumstances. His rage when he'd burst through the study door. His desperate love, so new and overwhelming it frightened even him. And beneath it all, steady as bedrock, his certainty that she was his, that he was hers, that they were always meant to find each other, even through war and betrayal and cages. Marcus released her throat, his tongue soothing over the bite mark that now blazed against her skin. When he lifted his head, his eyes were molten gold and his expression was one of pure, staggered devotion. Lyra, he breathed. She didn't let him finish. She surged up, pressing her mouth to the junction of his neck and shoulder, and bit down. He jerked against her with a broken sound, his arms crushing her closer as his blood flooded her mouth, copper and pine and home. The bond completed with a sound like a thunderclap inside her chest. She felt herself pour into him, her fear, her resilience, her desperate love for the child they would raise together. Her fury at everyone who had hurt her, and her wonder that she could feel fury at all after years of teaching herself to go numb. Her trust, hard-won and precious, offered to him like a gift. His hand splayed across her belly, and she felt his awe at the life growing there, his acceptance of the child as his, regardless of blood, regardless of origin. Mine, she whispered against his skin. Yours, he breathed back. Mate. The words settled between them like a vow. Lyra released her bite, laving her tongue across the mark she'd left on his shoulder, and felt him shudder beneath her hands. They held each other as the bond settled into golden certainty, his heartbeat beneath her ear, steady and sure. Her body pressed against his, finally warm after so long in the cold. The baby stirred, then quieted, as if sensing the safety that now surrounded them. "I thought I'd lost everything," Marcus murmured. "I thought I'd be alone forever. And then you came." "In a cage," Lyra reminded him, a watery laugh escaping her throat. "In a cage," he agreed. "Looking at me like you were ready to tear my throat out if I touched you." "I was." "I know." He pressed a kiss to the mark on her neck, and she felt the action echo through the bond. Tenderness, possession, adoration. "You were magnificent." The pack gathered at sunrise. Lyra stood beside Marcus on the fortress steps, wearing a dress of deep green that Miriam had found somewhere and altered to fit her growing belly. The mark on her neck was visible to everyone, his claim, his promise, his binding. And on his shoulder, just visible above his collar, her mark gleamed in the early light. "Luna Queen," the pack healer announced, her voice carrying across the crowded courtyard. "Lyra Valewood." Valewood, not Stormborn. The name settled over her like a mantle, and she felt Marcus's pride pulse through the bond. The pack knelt. Warriors, servants, nobles, children. Every wolf in Valewood lowering their heads to the Omega, who had arrived in a cage and would now help rule them. "Rise," Marcus said, his voice carrying with easy authority. "And witness, the tribute system ends today. No pack under my protection will sell their members like cattle, and any wolf who flees such cruelty will find sanctuary within my borders." A murmur ran through the crowd. Lyra caught sight of the young servant woman who had smiled at her on that first terrible night, tears streaming down her face as she rose to her feet. "Additionally," Marcus continued, "Alpha Hendrix of the Stormborn Pack will answer for his crimes against his own people, including the sale of a pregnant Omega to settle debts he accumulated through his own incompetence." His arm tightened around Lyra's waist. "Justice will be thorough." It already has been, she thought, but she said nothing. She didn't need revenge. She needed this. The warmth of the sun on her face, the solid presence of her mate at her side, the future stretching out before her like an open road. That night, in the moonlit garden behind the fortress, Marcus held her against his chest while they watched the stars emerge. His hand rested on her belly, palms spread wide to feel every flutter of movement. "I didn't think I could have this," he said quietly. "Have what?" "Peace. A mate. A child." His lips brushed her temple. "Someone who looked at all of me, the wolf, the king, the broken pieces, and stayed anyway." Lyra turned in his arms, rising up on her toes to cup his face. The mate marks on both their necks caught the moonlight, twin symbols of belonging. "I'm not just staying," she said. "I'm fighting, I'm building, I'm choosing you every day for the rest of our lives." His smile, rare and beautiful, broke across his face like sunrise. "Then I suppose I'll have to choose you right back." Their foreheads touched, breath mingling, the bond humming between them with perfect settled certainty. Behind them, the fortress stood solid and safe. Before them, the territory stretched toward distant peaks that no longer seemed threatening. And in her belly their child kicked once, strong and certain, as if agreeing that yes, this was exactly where they all belonged.